I never imagined that my herb garden would become the catalyst for the most absurd conflict of my life. My name is Sam, and I've lived in Pinewood Estates for 3 years now. It's one of those pristine suburban neighborhoods where every lawn is exactly 2.5 inches tall and mailboxes come in exactly 3 approved colors. The kind of place where the HOA rules could fill a small library. And presiding over this kingdom of beige conformity was Karen Whitmore, our illustrious HOA president, a woman who treated every bylaw like it was handed down from on high. Karen was in her early 50s, always dressed like she was about to attend a country club luncheon, even when she was just patrolling the neighborhood looking for violations. Her blonde hair was shellacked into submission, and she carried a designer handbag that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. But her real accessory was her clipboard, always at the ready to document the smallest infraction. I'll admit, I'm not your typical suburban resident. I work from home as a consultant for pharmaceutical companies, specializing in ethnobotany and traditional medicine applications. It's a niche field that pays extremely well, and over the years, I've built up quite a network of connections ranging from university researchers to legal experts in property law. My backyard reflected my profession with raised beds full of medicinal herbs, some common like lavender and chamomile, others more exotic like ashwagandha and holy basil. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was outside tending to my moonflower vines, which had just started blooming their gorgeous white flowers that open at night, when Karen appeared at my fence line like a perfumed apparition. Karen's voice, shrill and accusatory, "Excuse me. Excuse me. What exactly do you think you're growing back here?" I straightened up, trowel in hand, and gave her my friendliest smile. "Good morning, Karen. Just some ornamental flowers and culinary herbs. The moonflowers are really something, aren't they? They only bloom at night, which is fascinating from a pollination standpoint." Her eyes narrowed as she scanned my garden with obvious suspicion. "These plants look highly irregular. I don't recall seeing approval forms for exotic vegetation." Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws clearly states that all landscaping must maintain the aesthetic character of the neighborhood. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd absolutely love it if you could hit that like button and subscribe to Karen Eat World. Your support helps me bring you more wild tales of HOA drama and petty revenge. Trust me, this story is just getting started, and you won't want to miss what happens next. "They're just herbs, Karen," I explained patiently. "Basil, mint, some medicinal plants I use for my research. Everything is well maintained and behind my fence, so it's not visible from the street." She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures. "We'll see what the board has to say about this. Some of us take pride in maintaining property values, unlike others who seem determined to turn their yards into some sort of jungle." I let it go. It wasn't worth the argument, and I knew my garden was completely within the guidelines. My plants were healthy, the beds were neat, and everything was contained to my backyard. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few weeks, Karen found increasingly creative reasons to show up at my property. She complained that my wind chimes, delicate brass tubes that made soft melodic sounds, were noise pollution. She insisted my garden lights, simple solar stakes that illuminated the pathways at night, violated some obscure ordinance about light pollution. She even tried to cite me for having decorative stones in my garden that were apparently not from the pre-approved list of landscaping materials. Each time, I responded with documentation proving I was in compliance. Each time, she left frustrated, her heels clicking in angry staccato on my driveway. I could have escalated things, but I prefer to handle conflicts professionally. Besides, I was busy with a major project consulting for a legal pharmaceutical company on their new herbal supplement line, which meant long hours on video calls with lawyers and researchers. Then came the incident that changed everything. It was late October, the week before Halloween. I had been working on some research late into the evening, comparing notes on traditional preparation methods for various tinctures. Around 11 p.m., I decided to take a break and check on my night-blooming plants. I brought out my laptop to make some notes, along with a cup of herbal tea and a few of my reference books. The moonflowers were in full glory, their white blooms almost luminescent in the moonlight. I was photographing them for my research database when I noticed a shadow at the fence line. Karen was there, phone out, recording me. "Can I help you, Karen?" I called out, keeping my voice level. "It's pretty late for a neighborhood inspection." She didn't even have the grace to look embarrassed. Her voice, triumphant and smug, I knew it. I knew something strange was going on over here. Sneaking around in the middle of the night with your books and potions, doing who knows what kind of rituals. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. Rituals? Karen, I'm taking pictures of flowers and drinking chamomile tea. I'm a botanist, not a witch. I know what I saw, she insisted, her phone still recording. And the other neighbors have noticed too. Strange smells coming from your yard at odd hours, unusual plants, lights on at all times of night. This neighborhood has standards, and we don't tolerate this kind of activity. What kind of activity? I asked, genuinely baffled. Gardening? Research? Drinking tea? She leaned closer to the fence, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that was probably still audible 3 houses away. Witchcraft. You're practicing witchcraft, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows about it. I stood there, stunned, as she marched away, presumably to share her evidence with anyone who would listen. Witchcraft. The woman actually thought I was practicing witchcraft because I grew herbs and worked unusual hours. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so concerning. The next morning, I found a formal notice from the HOA stuck to my door. I was being summoned to an emergency meeting to address concerns regarding inappropriate activities and potential bylaw violations related to unconventional practices. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. I spent that week documenting everything. I'm nothing if not thorough. I compiled scientific papers on every plant in my garden, photographs with timestamps, my work credentials, and references from university colleagues. I also quietly reached out to my attorney, Marcus Chen, who specialized in property law and had helped me navigate some complex zoning issues with a previous real estate investment. Marcus on the phone, amused, "Let me get this straight. Your HOA president thinks you're a witch because you have a garden?" "That's the situation," I confirmed. "I know it sounds ridiculous, but she's got enough influence in this neighborhood that she could make my life very difficult. I need to know my legal standing." Well, the good news is that religious discrimination is illegal, even if witchcraft were actually a religion you practiced. The bad news is that HOAs can make life miserable in 1,000 legal ways if they want to. Document everything, stay compliant with every rule, and let me know if she escalates. The emergency meeting was held in the community center, a bland beige building that matched the bland beige aesthetic of the entire neighborhood. About 20 residents showed up, most looking confused about why they were there. Karen stood at the front, her presentation already loaded on the projector screen. The first slide was a blurry photo of me in my garden at night. The second was a close-up of my moonflowers. The third was a shot of my herbs, with several circled in red. Karen's voice, grave and dramatic, "Neighbors, I've called you here tonight because we have a serious situation that threatens the very character of Pinewood Estates. As your HOA president, it's my duty to maintain our community standards and ensure the safety and well-being of all residents." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a list of suspicious activities that included unusual plants, nighttime activities, strange odors, and unconventional lifestyle. "I have reason to believe," she continued, her voice dropping for effect, "that one of our residents is engaging in witchcraft and occult practices. I have photographic evidence of late-night rituals, the cultivation of substances used in spellcasting, and behavior that is wholly inconsistent with our community values." There were murmurs in the crowd. Some people looked skeptical, others concerned. I sat quietly in the back, waiting for my turn to speak. Karen went on for another 10 minutes, building her case with the fervor of a prosecutor in a Salem witch trial. She showed more photos, read excerpts from websites about herbs used in magical practices, and even suggested that my unusual work schedule was evidence of nefarious activities. Finally, she turned to me. Her voice, challenging, "Would you like to explain yourself?" I stood up, carrying my own folder of documentation. I'd be happy to. Thank you all for coming tonight. I understand there's been some confusion about my gardening activities, and I'd like to clear that up. I walked to the front and connected my laptop to the projector. My name is Sam Rivera, and I'm an ethnobotanist. I hold a doctorate in pharmaceutical sciences and work as a consultant for several major pharmaceutical companies, researching traditional plant-based medicines for modern applications. Everything in my garden is either a common culinary herb or a plant used in legitimate medical research. I clicked through my slides, showing my credentials, publications, and professional affiliations. Then I showed detailed information about each plant Karen had flagged as suspicious. This is ashwagandha, an adaptogenic herb used in traditional Ayurvedic medicine and currently being studied for stress reduction. This is holy basil, also called tulsi, which is being researched for its anti-inflammatory properties. This is mugwort, which has been used in traditional Chinese medicine for thousands of years and is currently being studied for its potential in treating digestive issues. Every single plant in my garden has legitimate medical applications and is legal to grow. I could see Karen's face reddening as I spoke. As for my nighttime rituals, I work with international clients in different time zones, which means I keep irregular hours. And yes, I do enjoy spending time in my garden at night, because that's when certain flowers bloom and when I have free time after work calls. There's no bylaw against being in your own backyard after dark. Several neighbors nodded. A few were even smiling. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Karen stood up, her face now fully flushed. Her voice, shaking with anger, "This is exactly what I'd expect from someone practicing dark arts. Fancy explanations and academic credentials don't change what you are. I've seen the evidence with my own eyes." "Karen," I said calmly, "I'm not a witch. I'm a scientist." "Then explain the chanting," she shouted. "My bedroom window faces your yard, and I've heard you chanting in foreign languages at midnight." I blinked. I listen to podcasts in different languages while I garden. It helps me maintain my language skills for international work. Currently, I'm brushing up on my Mandarin. She wasn't listening. She had worked herself into a full frenzy now. "And the smoke. The strange smoke coming from your yard. That would be my fire pit. Which is permitted under HOA guidelines as long as it's used safely and not excessively. I occasionally burn dried herbs from my garden for their pleasant scent." "Incense," she practically shrieked. "Ritual incense." The meeting devolved from there. Despite the HOA board's obvious discomfort with Karen's accusations, they couldn't outright dismiss her because she was the president and held significant sway. They agreed to monitor the situation and asked me to be mindful of how my activities might be perceived by neighbors. I left that meeting knowing that this wasn't over. Karen had committed herself to a narrative, and she wasn't going to let it go. Sure enough, over the next few weeks, the harassment intensified. She started keeping a log of every time my lights were on past 10 p.m. She filed noise complaints about my wind chimes. She even tried to get signatures on a petition to ban exotic plants from the neighborhood. But the final straw came when I discovered that she had been going door to door, telling neighbors to keep their children away from my house because I was dangerous. Several parents stopped letting their kids sell Girl Scout cookies or fundraiser items at my door. One neighbor awkwardly admitted that Karen had told her I was practicing dark magic and might curse anyone who crossed me. This had gone from annoying to genuinely damaging. I called Marcus again. "She's now making statements that could constitute defamation," he said after I explained the situation. "Accusing you of being dangerous, suggesting you're a threat to children without any basis in fact. That's serious. You could sue." "I don't want to sue," I said. "I just want her to stop. But more than that, I want her to understand how ridiculous she's being." There was a pause on the line. "You know," Marcus said slowly, "there might be another approach. A creative one. How committed are you to staying in this neighborhood long term?" "Why do you ask?" "Because I might have an idea that would solve your problem permanently." But it requires you to be willing to make some investments and get a little theatrical. I listened as Marcus laid out his plan, and by the end of it, I was grinning. It was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Let's do it, I said. The first phase began immediately. I reached out to every single neighbor in Pinewood Estates, all 73 households, with a formal letter of introduction. In it, I explained my profession, provided references, and invited anyone with questions to contact me directly. I included my credentials, my published research, and even testimonials from colleagues. The letter was professional, friendly, and thoroughly documented. More importantly, I included an invitation to a neighborhood gathering at my home. A garden party, where everyone could see my plants firsthand, ask questions, and enjoy some refreshments. The invitation went out on expensive cardstock with elegant printing. Very official, very legitimate. Karen immediately sent out her own email to the HOA, warning people not to attend, claiming it was some kind of recruitment event for a cult. But the invitation had been too well crafted, too professional. People were curious. And I had made sure to mention that refreshments would include samples from my garden like lavender lemonade and mint tea, all perfectly normal things. The day of the garden party arrived. I had spent the previous week making my garden absolutely pristine. Every plant was labeled with both its common name and scientific name, along with a brief description of its uses. I had printed out several of my published papers and set up a table with information about ethnobotany as a field. I hired a small catering company to provide additional refreshments that had nothing to do with my garden, just to keep things above board. 42 people showed up. More than half the neighborhood. They walked through my garden, asked questions, tried the lavender cookies and herbal teas, and generally had a pleasant afternoon. Several people apologized for believing Karen's accusations. A few even asked for advice on starting their own herb gardens. Karen, predictably, did not attend. But I noticed her watching from her window, her face a mask of fury. The second phase began that evening. I had recruited every single person who attended the garden party, along with several others who couldn't make it but had reached out afterward. I explained the situation fully, Karen's harassment, her accusations, and the damage it was causing. And then I explained my plan. It was simple, really. If Karen wanted to believe I was a witch, then the neighborhood would give her a witch. Not a real one, of course, but a performance so convincing, so elaborate, that it would force her to confront the absurdity of her own fears. I had discovered something interesting in my research on local property laws. Pinewood Estates, like many HOAs, had very specific rules about what homeowners could and couldn't do. But there were no rules whatsoever about guests or community gatherings. And there were certainly no rules against theatrical performances or celebrations on private property with the owner's permission. The third phase required some investment. I purchased several items online: battery-operated candles by the dozen, fog machines, speakers for atmospheric music, robes in various colors that I borrowed from a local theater company Marcus had connections with, and props that looked mystical but were completely harmless. I also reached out to a friend from graduate school who taught theater at a local university. She was delighted to help with the choreography. We set the date for the next full moon, which was 2 weeks away. In the meantime, I made sure that Karen was aware something was happening. I didn't tell her directly, of course. That would ruin the surprise. Instead, I simply went about my normal activities, but I added a few theatrical touches. I started playing Gregorian chants in my garden in the evening. Completely legal, completely innocent, but atmospheric. I installed additional solar lights in purple and blue, arranged in geometric patterns. I hung wind chimes made of crystals that caught the light beautifully. Everything I did was well within HOA guidelines, but all of it fed into the narrative Karen had created in her own mind. She complained, of course. Multiple times. But each time, the HOA board had to admit that I wasn't violating any rules. I was just decorating my garden. The board members, who had attended my garden party, were starting to look at Karen with increasing skepticism. The final touch came 3 days before the full moon. I sent out another round of invitations, this time to everyone in the neighborhood. The invitation read: "You are cordially invited to attend a full moon garden celebration in honor of the autumn harvest. Join us for an evening of community, reflection, and appreciation for nature's bounty. Refreshments will be provided. Costumes optional but encouraged. All are welcome." It was signed by me and co-signed by 35 neighbors who had agreed to participate. Karen received her invitation too. I made sure of it. The evening of the full moon arrived, and it was perfect. The sky was clear, the moon was bright, and the temperature was just cool enough to be comfortable. My backyard had been transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a fantasy film. The fog machines were set up around the perimeter. The battery-operated candles were arranged in concentric circles. The speakers were hidden in the bushes, ready to play the atmospheric music we'd selected. At 7 p.m., my neighbors started to arrive. And they had really committed to the bit. People wore robes, cloaks, and flowing garments. Some had flower crowns. Others carried decorative staffs or wore costume jewelry that sparkled in the candlelight. My theater friend had taught a few volunteers some simple choreographed movements that looked ritualistic but were really just interpretive dance. By 7:30, there were over 50 people in my backyard, all dressed up, all in on the plan. We gathered in a large circle around the garden. I stood at the center, wearing a simple dark robe that my theater friend had lent me. I could see Karen's house from my yard. Her bedroom light was on. She was watching. Perfect. I raised my hands, and the music began. It was dramatic but beautiful, a mix of classical and ambient sounds. The fog machines activated, sending wisps of mist across the ground. The candles flickered. And then we began. It wasn't a ritual, of course. It was theater. Pure theater. But it looked impressive. We had practiced enough that everyone knew their parts. We moved in synchronized patterns around the garden. We raised our hands to the moon. Someone read poetry about nature and seasons. Another person led a guided meditation about gratitude for the earth's bounty. Every single element was completely innocent. It was essentially a community gathering with atmospheric decoration. But in the darkness, with the fog and the candlelight and the flowing robes and the dramatic music, it looked exactly like what Karen feared most. I saw her window open. Saw her lean out, her phone in hand, recording everything. Phase 4 was already in motion. Marcus and I had spent the last 2 weeks documenting every single instance of Karen's harassment. Every complaint, every accusatory email, every door-to-door campaign. We had statements from neighbors about her defamatory comments. We had records of HOA meetings where she had made unfounded accusations. We had everything we needed. But we weren't going to sue. That was too simple. Instead, Marcus had discovered something fascinating in his research on Pinewood Estates HOA. The HOA bylaws included a provision for removing board members, including the president, if they could be shown to have acted in a manner that was detrimental to community harmony and contrary to the best interests of the association. Harassment of a resident based on religious discrimination definitely qualified. Especially when that harassment was documented, witnessed, and had resulted in measurable harm to community relationships. Moreover, Marcus had uncovered something else. Karen's term as president was up for renewal in 2 months. And according to the bylaws, any resident in good standing could run for the position. Including me. But I didn't want to be HOA president. I had a better idea. The ritual in my backyard continued for about an hour. We sang songs about nature. We shared food and drink. We told stories. And all the while, Karen watched from her window, recording, probably preparing her evidence for what she surely thought would be her vindication. When the gathering ended, people lingered, laughing and chatting. Several commented on how much fun it had been, how creative and community building. A few asked if we could make it a monthly event. The whole thing had brought the neighborhood together in a way that nothing else had in years. The next morning, Karen's response was swift and predictable. An emergency HOA meeting was called. The subject line of her email read, "Urgent, occult activity confirmed." This time I was ready. So were my neighbors. The meeting was packed. Every seat was full, with people standing along the walls. Karen stood at the front, triumphant, her laptop connected to the projector. She had compiled her video footage into a presentation that she clearly thought was damning. Her voice, victorious, "Finally, I have undeniable proof of what I've been trying to warn you all about. Last night, in clear violation of community standards and common decency, a ritual was performed on neighborhood property. I have video evidence." She played her footage. There we were, dozens of neighbors in robes, moving in patterns, raising our hands, surrounded by candlelight and fog. It did look impressive, I had to admit. "This," Karen declared, "is exactly what I've been trying to protect this neighborhood from. This is witchcraft, pure and simple, and it has no place in Pinewood Estates." I stood up. "Karen, that was a community garden party with a costume theme. Everything you just showed was a group of neighbors getting together to celebrate the full moon with poetry, meditation, and snacks. There was no witchcraft. There was no occult activity. There were just people having fun." "Lies," she shouted. "I know what I saw." One by one, my neighbors stood up. They explained what the event actually was. They testified that it was innocent, that they had participated willingly, that it was just a themed gathering. The HOA board members looked increasingly uncomfortable. Then Marcus stood up. I hadn't told anyone he was coming, but he had every right to be there as my legal representative. "If I may," he said calmly, "I'd like to address the board. My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm an attorney specializing in property law and HOA governance. I'm here representing my client, who has been subjected to months of harassment based on religious discrimination." Karen's face went pale. Marcus continued, his voice professional and measured. "My client has documented every instance of harassment, every false accusation, and every defamatory statement made by your current president. We have witnessed statements from multiple residents confirming that Ms. Whitmore has gone door to door making baseless accusations about my client being dangerous, practicing dark magic, and posing a threat to children. This constitutes harassment and defamation." He pulled out a folder thick with documentation. "Furthermore, Ms. Whitmore's actions have been detrimental to community harmony. She has created division where none existed, made residents afraid of a neighbor who has done nothing wrong, and violated the very bylaws she's supposed to uphold by discriminating against a resident based on her perception of their religious or spiritual practices." The board members were leafing through copies of the documentation Marcus had provided. Their faces grew more serious with each page. "Now," Marcus said, "we could pursue legal action for defamation and harassment. However, my client would prefer a different resolution. According to the HOA bylaws, Section 28, Paragraph 3, the board has the authority to remove an officer who has acted in a manner detrimental to the association. We are formally requesting that the board exercise this authority." Karen found her voice. Shrill and desperate, "This is ridiculous. I'm protecting this neighborhood. I'm the victim here." "You're the victim?" One of my neighbors stood up. It was Margaret, a retired teacher who lived 3 doors down. "Karen, you've been terrorizing this poor person for months over a garden." "A garden? You've spread lies, made people afraid, and divided our community. And for what? Because someone grows herbs and works odd hours?" Another neighbor stood. Then another. One by one, people voiced their support for removing Karen from her position. Some were people who had attended my garden party. Others were residents who had simply grown tired of her increasingly erratic behavior. The vote was called. It was nearly unanimous. Karen Whitmore was removed as HOA President, effective immediately. But that wasn't the final twist. That came 2 days later. I had done some additional research with Marcus's help. Pinewood Estates HOA owned several common areas, including the community center, a small park, and a retention pond. What most residents didn't know was that the land had been donated to the HOA by the original developer with specific deed restrictions. One of those restrictions stated that if the HOA ever ceased to function as a governing body, or if its governance was found to be discriminatory or in violation of fair housing laws, the property would revert to a community trust managed by the county. Karen's documented harassment, based on religious discrimination, provided grounds for that very scenario. I didn't push for dissolution of the entire HOA. That would have been too much, and I actually liked my neighborhood. Instead, I worked with Marcus and several interested neighbors to propose a complete restructure. We drafted new bylaws, more reasonable ones, that focused on actual property maintenance rather than micromanagement. We established term limits for board positions. We created an appeals process for disputes. And we added explicit non-discrimination clauses. The new bylaws passed with overwhelming support. But here's where it gets beautiful. Remember how I mentioned I work in pharmaceutical consulting? One of my clients had been looking for a location to establish a community wellness center, a place where they could offer educational programs about traditional medicine, herbal remedies, and holistic health. I had mentioned Pinewood Estates to them, particularly the community center that was now operating under new, more reasonable management. They were very interested. So interested that they made a generous donation to the HOA to fund renovations of the community center. In exchange, they would host monthly educational programs there, free to all residents, about ethnobotany, traditional medicine, and sustainable gardening. The programs would be run by experts in the field, including me. The sign went up outside the community center 3 months later, Pinewood Estates Community Wellness Center, proudly featuring the Sam Rivera Ethnobotanical Education Series. I was in my garden when Karen drove past for the first time after the sign went up. I watched her car slow down, watched her read the sign, watched her face transform from confusion to understanding to absolute horror. She finally got it. Every complaint she had made, every accusation, every attempt to paint me as some kind of threat had backfired spectacularly. Not only had I been vindicated, but her own obsessive campaign had resulted in the entire community embracing exactly what she had tried to eliminate. The witchcraft she feared was now being celebrated as science and education. The dangerous practices were now official community programming. And the person she had tried to drive out was now literally immortalized on a sign at the entrance to the neighborhood. Her car stopped completely in the middle of the street. Through my fence, I could see her gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her mouth open in shock as the full scope of what had happened finally crystallized in her mind. She had wanted to expose a witch. Instead, she had created an educational institution. She had wanted to drive me out. Instead, she had been removed from power and I had become a respected community figure. She had wanted to use the rules against me. Instead, every single rule and bylaw had been turned against her. I raised my cup of chamomile tea in a small, private salute as I watched understanding wash over her face. The look of complete and utter defeat was absolutely perfect. If you loved this story of petty HOA drama turning into the ultimate legal revenge, please hit that like button and subscribe to Karen Eat World. I've got tons more stories of entitled Karens getting exactly what they deserve. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for listening, and remember, sometimes the best revenge is just giving people exactly what they ask for.